Have you ever thought about a pen name for your writing? Well, I am, and I'll talk about that next. So for many of us as writers, we are sometimes taking on subjects that might be a little bit sensitive to people that we know, that might not be as appreciated by people that we know, that are just kind of beyond what people would expect us to write, but are still entertaining and have value to different audiences. You just may not want to be quite so direct with your name attached to it, but it doesn't mean that the work that you're doing doesn't have value to people and should not be put out there for people to consume it. And one of the things that I've been studying on, and I'm not sure if I'm going to go in this direction, but I'm certainly considering it very strongly, is to use a pen name for some of the stories that I have that are a little bit outside the box again for what people would expect from me, but are still entertaining stories that have value to people. And this is something that people do many times when they're writing on topics that are maybe a little bit taboo, that they might not want to be quite so directly connected to. And so I'm really looking into it and some of the positives and negatives of using a pen name, even for novels that necessarily, or novellas that aren't necessarily controversial, but maybe are just something that I'm experimenting with. Because I do have a lot of stories like that that I've experimented with that I think are good stories, but they're not typically the kind of stories that I would necessarily focus on from a more mainstream thought standpoint, at least for me. But are stories that maybe I wrote, some of them are stories that I wrote like in high school, some of them are stories that I wrote early in college, some of them are stories that I wrote, believe it or not, over a weekend or over the course of a couple of weeks, that are interesting stories, but maybe have a narrower audience that is just different from the kind of audience that I would probably normally share my stories with. And so I'm looking into it, and I think it might be kind of interesting. I'll be curious to see what the research tells me about pen names and how they work for some people. Some very famous authors have used pen names before, Stephen King among them. And so it's really interesting to see how that has worked for some famous authors, and maybe even some authors who maybe aren't quite as well known or mainstream that have used pen names. So I'm looking into it and thinking it might be an interesting idea to get some of those cool stories that I have buried on my hard drive of my computer or other hard drives that could be of benefit to people, that could be entertaining to some people, but it's just a matter of finding the right way of getting them out, and a pen name could be that way that could work for me. So I'm going to think about it, but if you've got any thoughts about pen names and whether they're good or bad, let me know in the comments section. I'd be curious to hear what other people think, and if there are others out there who have used them, and I know you're out there, then I'd be curious to hear from you as well.